Well, thanks to all of you for coming to today's Authors at Google talk. We have Hal Jaffe with us today, and I wanted to start out the introduction with find a seam, plant a mine, slip away. Where minds are, quote, imaginative interrogative constructions in the Brechtian sense. This is what Hal Jaffe advocates in a lead essay for the American Book Review entitled Guerrilla Writing. He was thereafter known as the Guerrilla Writer. Jaffe is the author of numerous docufiction collections, novels, and essays, which have been translated into German, Japanese, Spanish, Italian, French, Polish, Czech, and Farsi. In 2004, the Journal of Experimental Fiction devoted an issue to Jaffe's writing entitled The Literary Terrorism of Harold Jaffe. Wish I could redo that. He has won many awards, including a California Arts Council grant in fiction, National Endowment Awards in fiction, several Pushcart Prizes, and 2 Fulbright grants. Hal Jaffe is a professor of literature and creative writing at San Francisco State. No, I knew I was going to do that. At San Diego State, sorry, we're in San Francisco. San Diego State University and editor-in-chief of the Literary Cultural Journal of Fiction International. And he's here today to talk about his new book, Anti-Twitter. Please welcome.
Researchers asked people with high and low self-esteem to repeat, "I am a lovable person." They then measured participants' feelings about themselves. In the low self-esteem group, those who repeated the feel-good mantra felt worse afterwards. However, when people with high self-esteem repeated the mantra, they felt better, though only slightly. Hello, my name is Slavoj Žižek. I'm a Lacanian Marxist, a thinker of the highest order, but I aspire to be a rock star, and that's the reason I'm dressed, the way I am. No, actually, I'm Harold Jaffe, as Anne was kind enough to indicate, and I'm going to read to you from Anti-Twitter. These are all very short. They're exactly 50 words, so while I'm reading, I'll see whether you're slipping or not, and if you are, we could move to questions. Walter Benjamin inhabited that place at which weakness and genius coincide. Nor did Walter Benjamin kill himself with an overdose of morphine, as was widely reported. He shot morphine into his left thigh because he never found anything else he liked to inject into his left thigh nearly as much. Memory. He remembered his name, nothing more. After undergoing eye surgery as an adolescent, he lost the ability to form memories. For the next 58 years, each time he met a friend, each time he ate a meal, each time he walked the streets, it was the first time. A woman mauled by a kangaroo refused comment on the bizarre attack. Christine V. was assaulted by a boxing kangaroo outside her upscale condominium yesterday afternoon and taken to hospital. After being released, she brushed aside the incident. Fact: boxing kangaroos have been venturing ever closer to upscale condominiums. Shuffle. They've seized your shoelaces. You're in a padded cell, cement floor, gray padded walls, no window, no way to hang yourself without shoelaces. Not much to do but shuffle from the cot to the steel gray wall and back again. Remember not to lift your feet in their laceless shoes. Transgender toilet. A fracas erupted in the Italian Parliament's ladies' toilet between MPs Gardini, centre-right, and Luxuria, transgender communist. Gardini, former showgirl, expressed outrage after inadvertently meeting Luxuria, former sex worker, in the toilet. The incident has provoked a heated debate about which toilet the transgender MP should properly use. The new U.S. strategy 8 bloody years into Afghanistan is perception. The current perception is that the campaign is wildly adrift. Afghans must perceive that Americans are defeating the insurgency. Afghans must perceive their irrecoverable loss should they choose insurgency over democracy. That's the idea. Implementing it won't be easy. Reading Nietzsche, I hear a bird in trouble, a house finch with a tumor on its head. I capture it and put it in a cage with water, feed. Nietzsche argued vigorously against empathy, then, weeping, embraced a cart horse that had been whipped. Madness embraced him the following year. Vincent van Gogh, under the supervision of Dr. Gachet, shoots himself but misses a vital organ. He struggles to his cot and lies there facing the wall. When his devoted brother Theo comes, Vincent refuses to turn from the wall. He dies that way 2 days later, facing the wall. Lady Day is ambulanced to Metropolitan Hospital in New York with liver and heart disease, May 31st, 1959. Arrested at the hospital for heroin possession. Remains under police guard at the hospital until she dies from cirrhosis of the liver, July 17th, 1959. 44 years old. Nobody knew who she was. An unaccounted victim of the United States torture policy is a young Army corporal from New Jersey, name withheld. She witnessed the violent interrogation of Iraqi prisoners and was deeply troubled. 6 weeks after her appeal for reassignment was denied, she shot herself dead with her government issue semi-automatic. War Mother. The reason I'm standing in the rain handing out Stop the War flyers is my son, Camilo. He joined up to learn a trade, 17 years old. I gave permission because where we live was just drugs and gangs. Better the Marines than jail. Now I'm thinking jail would have been better. These are not just any spaces, as I'm looking for the text to read. These are charged spaces, I think of it in the Buddhist sense, like the space between notes in Beethoven's late quartets, for example. That's how I like to think of them. 19 toucans. Gazing through the small cracked window of her room at dusk, she sees 19 toucans flying low, languidly, in single file from west to east. It was said there were alligators in the mangroves. Naked, she lies on her back in a mangrove swamp in the jungle denseness. Chet Baker, after a heroin deal turned bloody, the baby-faced bad boy is transformed into Mr. Down and Out. The interesting thing is Chet doesn't seem to care. Not being pretty, face busted up, age 27. Shoot the right grade of shit, and you just don't give a shit. Machine sex. No hokey come-ons, no pheromone aftershave, no premature ejac, no sexual politics, no big dick narcissism, no faked foreplay, no insincere dirty talk, no, I've shot my bolt, sorry about that. Machines provide exactly what you need. And if après sex you want a cigarette, you don't have to share. Well, here's something finally about technology. I've been describing a wide arc, but here's something about technology. Dead wired. Online social networks are crucial to our lives and increasingly crucial when we die. An industry has emerged to deal with online contacts after death. Through a site called Death Switch, humans post posthumous emails, announcements on online social networks, and send text messages. Current cost, $16 per month. About opium, Jean Cocteau, himself addicted, suggested that official chemistry modify opium's toxicity while salvaging the euphoria, which would mean ungoverned pleasure committed by the ungovernable, not just in the realm of culture, as with Dada, for example, but spiriting its bliss into the most intimate orifices of globalism. A man pretending to be dying of cancer was sentenced to prison. The former Pontiac salesman claimed to have kidney, lung, and prostate cancer. He shaved his head and dropped red dye in the toilet to simulate blood in his urine. He faked seizures, slamming his head into walls. Kung Fu TV legend David Carradine was found hanging naked inside a wardrobe in his Bangkok luxury hotel. A cord was attached to his neck and a second cord to his genitals. There was no suicide note. The possibility of a sex game gone wrong could not be ruled out. Researchers have begun to unravel the information and social content embedded in the hyena's uncanny laugh. Younger hyenas have high-pitched giggles, and dominant females of the strongly hierarchical clans have a narrower range of sounds. It has been hypothesized that the laughing is not a sign of good humor. I'm going to hasten toward the end a little bit here. Blame it on Chavez. The Easter dish of choice in Venezuela is the capybara, an oversized rodent, cousin to the guinea pig, though river-based like a beaver. Venezuelans regard the creature as more fish than meat, a useful deception during Lent when it replaces red meat in this predominantly Roman Catholic country. Young Fulbrighter, I'd landed in Islamabad International Airport when I heard John Lennon singing Imagine for the first time. I've heard it innumerable times since, but today, 5/17/09, in the small market near my Paris flat, I hear it while shopping and am moved. Can it be 38 years? Buto, B-U-T-O-H. The Japanese spirit dance meanders in twists and turns between living and dead. Dead is another version of irrational. Whenever I gaze around me, I want to plunge into the irrational. Whenever I look upward, face downward, or stare in front of me, I want to plunge in the irrational. Last words, death row. Well, moms, that's how it played out. Love life, live long. Dealing with reality ain't always what you want it to be. Tell my kids I love them. God is real. He fixin' to find out some deep things that are real. Take care of yourselves. Last words, death row. Been hanging around this popsicle stand way too long. Before I go, I want to say something to all y'all. Bury me deep, lay 2 speakers at my feet, put headphones on my skull, and rock and roll me when I'm dead. Shit eaters, I'll see you in hell. Thank you. You know, I find a text. I don't always alter the figure of the text, but I alter the ground. I put it in some other place. I sometimes change the spaces, and the original text is not art, but the one in the other context is art. Why is it art? Because I propose that it be art. It's a conceptual notion, right? I think of the Thai artist Tiravanija. He was involved in a kind of installation process where he would bicycle around the New York area and find deserted gaps or devastated Rite Aids or these cavernous kinds of large stores, and he would furnish them with stoves and refrigerators and chairs and long tables and comfort food, and he would invite the homeless to eat, and they would be fed. He himself would be serving the food. And they would be fed for 23 days. Homeless people would feed homeless people for 23 days. Then he would give away the appliances and move on, find another place and do the same thing for 23 days. 23 was William Burroughs' favorite number, if you remember that. And he himself didn't propose that what he was doing was art, but other people did. There was no residue. There was no, except, the food that the people ate. There was nothing palpable about what it was that could be called art, and yet he called it art. And arguably, it is a kind of art, conceptually. Not so much the aesthetic object, but what it does to the mind. I mean, how one thinks about it afterwards. That's something of what I'm doing by displacing these found texts, which profess to be information. But we know that actually they're mostly disinformation, deception, distraction, and ideology. And by defamiliarizing them, one can see them differently, more clearly. Sometimes I alter them fairly decisively. Other times I do very little to them. It's also the proximity of where they are and the texts that are around them that matter. You know, as I was mentioning to Galen back when we were walking here, you know, our milieu has changed. It's very difficult for us to get back to fundamental things. You know, we don't hear the mockingbird. You know, wilderness is being real estated and so on. Our milieu now is what professes to be information. That's the data we work with. That's the kind of material that we can do some interesting art with. It's not so much the idea of drafting something. It's more the idea of discovering something. You know, one doesn't have to be a good draftsman or draftswoman to be a good visual artist these days. Discovering, defamiliarizing, you know, being alert in that way can cover you, I think, interestingly. What is my disposition to all of this? Well, what do you think? Well, do you infer some disposition, some attitude that I have to this, or is it just pretty much hugger-mugger here? Well, you know, my attitude is to interrogate, you know, clearly, and to tease out whatever subtexts are there. Sometimes you don't have to do much more than simply displace it. I mean, there are important and obvious precedents to this. Probably the most famous one is Duchamp finding the urinal. It wasn't in Paris, but it was some street in France, and then writing "R. Mutt" on it and just exhibiting it. Didn't do anything to the figure at all, except maybe cleaned it up a little bit, added "R. Mutt," but just changed the ground. And there we had a found object that became art, you know, became a certain kind of art. That started a way of thinking, at least in the West, that's been influential. Do you want me to read a few more things to you? I didn't read all the incendiary ones. Yeah, please. Yeah.
Sort of relates to what you were talking about concerning artists. This comes from our Dory page. Are you claiming that there is a moral imperative on all artists, or at least the serious ones, to address the social issues of the day? Is there any value in art for art's sake?
Yeah, well, it's an important and inevitable question that, and not easy to answer. You know, I think of the writer Claribel Alegria, who is Nicaraguan, and she was writing particularly during the United States invasion of Nicaragua and Iran-Contra, and where they would use drug money to furnish the Contras. And she was asked about this imperative, and she said yes, she feels that the artist must address this, must bracket his or her concerns and address this. And the interviewer, in fact, I was the interviewer, asked her what would she do if she met an artist who wasn't addressing the war and the U.S. colonialism in Nicaragua, and she said, I'd refuse to shake his hand. Now, you might ask, what is it that permits the writer or the artist to have a special access or particular ability to articulate these difficulties and to address social questions and to be socially activist? What would you say about that? I mean, is there anything that an artist, I mean, people don't necessarily say all lawyers, you know, should address the social issues of the day. They might say that it would be good if doctors, you know, joined Médecins Sans Frontières, right? But with writers and artists, one does hear this. Why, though? What is it about, let's say, writers that give them any kind of special access into this. Do you have any feeling about that?
Personally, no, well, I don't think there should be constraints on artists in any form to the degree that, you know, if addressing social issues is what motivates you, that spurs you on, then that's great. But there, you know, if you are an artist and that is not your emphasis, I don't think there's anything wrong with that, because art is just free expression.
Yeah, good point. But is the free expression really free, or is it secretly complicitous? I mean, take an exaggerated situation like the Third Reich. You know, a lot of artists left Germany when this was going on, but some didn't. Some Aryan artists continued to produce, and they weren't writing about the war or doing images about the war. They were writing about the homeland and the country and the kinds of mythologies that have always been, you know, evident in Germany. Now, were they simply expressing themselves, or by turning their back on what was going on, were they being complicitous?
Complicitous, but I look at it more as perhaps survival, in the sense that, you know, those artists might have agreed with Third Reich ideology, but then again, if they decided to stay, it might have been just a matter of survival, of not being able to have the courage to, you know, to speak truth to power, as they say.
Yeah, well, sure. No, I think that's well put.
I'm trying to take this position where I'm not judging, but at the same time, as a human being, I do judge. You know, that particular ideology is totally offensive to me, and I would think that anybody would come against it. But life has so many shades of gray, and, you know, people are put in so many difficult situations. It's just really hard to say if they were being, you know, supporting that ideology, or, as I said, just trying to survive, not having the courage to speak out.
Yeah, no, understood. I think what, at least theoretically, gives an artist a particular access that people in other professions might not so readily have, is that the artist cultivates dream space and cultivates rumination, and spends time thinking in ways that aren't permitted to, let's say, people who work from 8 to 6. And the insights that come from this kind of contemplation are different and often useful to you know, to articulating. Also, artists, if they have any kind of reputation, have easy access to media, you know, that other people don't have. Now, take the situation of AIDS. When AIDS was happening, you know, you're a young woman, and so you were very young then, if you were even born. The kind of hate that was let loose was quite extraordinary, even for a country like this. The hate that was addressed, especially to gay men, then that's when ACT UP and Grand Fury came together, and gay people, but not exclusively gay people, bracketed what they were doing, and they decided to try to expropriate the expropriator and use the very weapons, you know, the propaganda against the people and institutions who were demonizing people with AIDS, and that's when the battle turned. And I think even though an entire generation was lost, I do believe it would have been a lot worse if ACT UP and Grand Fury didn't poster St. Patrick's Cathedral, where the then cardinal was about to give some talk demonizing AIDS, people with AIDS, and so on. I think it would have been a lot worse than it actually was. So their art intervention actually was very useful. Sometimes it can't be measured, you know, in that way. And even when it can't be measured, you know, I think there's a valid argument for it. But, you know, having said this, I do agree with you that I don't know that the imperative actually applies to everyone. There are some people who are incapable, you know, as artists.
They're wired to it.
Yeah.
Personally, you know, I do believe the artist has that obligation to address these issues. And in fact, I was thinking, my daughter is a theater major at the University of San Francisco, and part of that major is theater and social justice. And that's part, you know, that's combined.
Yeah.
And as she comes home, you know, in her youthful vigor, she talks about her art and how it influences and how she really wants to change things. And I think that's a perfect compliment. But at the same time, I think about some artist who just wants to get on television and have that, you know, be on American Idol and do something like that. They're an artist, but I don't think they're pushing any kind of social agenda.
No, I'm happy to hear that. But you know, as far as changing, effecting change, one can't ever expect the response to be commensurate with the effort. I think at a time like now, it's a question of bearing witness. You know, nobody knows what's going to happen to the works we do, whether they'll be, you know, absolutely in the hands of managers, you know, corporate managers, or well, they'll be somehow alive on the net, assuming that the net has some degree of freedom, you know, 25 years or 30 years from now. But the notion of bearing witness is a very important one, especially in a time like now, because change has been so accelerated. Just think, last 15 years, how people think, particularly technology, of course, has affected the way the world is viewed. Language, you know, has changed radically, very rapidly, because of the various shorthand ways. We don't look at events directly anymore, not that we're always easily able to. We look at them in a mediated way, through a screen or through a small screen. Well, what's going on? Instead of looking there's violence there, we look here, and we see the mediated form of the violence, which, of course, is going to have some lies and some, you know, some changes in it. So the idea of being an artist who bears witness, I don't think that's negligible. But again, you're right. There are people who aren't wired to do that. There are some artists who aren't wired to do that. And even if they live in a toxic, you know, environment such as the Third Reich, you know, perhaps one can argue that, you know, they're still doing the best they can. I think that's possible.
Here's another question that sort of falls under the same umbrella. How does the influence that corporate or government sponsors hold on current artists? Oh, I'm sorry. I think I did.
No, I know what you mean. If you're doing an exhibit which is virulently interrogative of what government and corporations are doing, and it's being shown at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and it's sponsored by Mobile, right? And Mobile does sponsor it. What does that mean? I mean, are you being complicit? I mean, when you see something on the wall in the museum sponsored by Mobile, you don't look at it in the same way as you might if you saw it in some sort of handout. The same thing applies to writers, arguably, who publish a book with Simon & Schuster, you know, which professes to be, you know, interrogative. Simon & Schuster wouldn't do it unless they misread it, which is very likely. Is the fact that it has that imprint immediately compromising? It's a hard question. I mean, the fact is, you know, we're living at a very imperfect time, and there are all kinds of quibbles and small sacrifices that one makes. If you see Guernica in the Museum of Modern Art or some other place, do you think about the small Spanish town that's being bombed, you know, by the fascists, or do you just see another exquisite experiment by Picasso there? That's part of the question. Yeah.
Well, I think if I understand things properly, what's going on is really a question of whether an omission can be an act. So if you have a duty to do something and then omitting, you know, say an artist has a duty to be socially active, whether failing to perform that duty is, you know, really something that can be is blameworthy. And what I find interesting is that in European countries, omission is generally considered to be, at least in law, something culpable. So if you see someone drowning and you could save them by throwing them a rope, and you don't, that's actually, you can be prosecuted for that. In America, in no state can you be prosecuted.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Very subtle. Yeah, there isn't any ongoing tradition of socially activist art in the United States. I mean, there have been moments. There were the transcendentalists who were against the slave trade. There were the people associated with IWW. There were the 30s communists, most of whom changed when Stalin came to power. There certainly, in the 60s, for that blip of a period from 1966, let's say, to 1972, there were young people who, at least in France, came close to overthrowing the country. But there were, as you know, in 68, there were protests, and very powerful ones, across the world in places you wouldn't expect. And including America. But generally speaking, if you compare the United States with France, if you compare it even with England, if you compare it with Germany, there hasn't been any ongoing, vital, ongoing social activist response in art. Just spots, but not. And that itself is an interesting question. Why that should be. And I think the response to that is complex. It has to do with a number of factors that govern, this country and sustain the way this country, functions.
I mean, it definitely has to tie into the sort of American mythology about personal freedom.
Yeah.
So here's a question. Why the recurring focus on the homeless? The outrages of current society and the responsibility of the artist in these times seem to both be clear themes. Poverty is a timeless issue. How does it fit in your general argument?
How does the notion of poverty fit into these? Well, I think, I read last words from people on death row. I think one of the important points is to see these people from the subject position. And I've dealt with this in different ways, extreme ways, where I've talked about serial killers and so on. And it's very easy to demonize people. And also I've written about art brut, people who are accounted, I use that verb deliberately, who are accounted mad but do some very unusual art. Art that's valued, but sometimes marginalized. I try to see them from the subject position. That is to imagine them talking, or even to find places where they've articulated sentences, or in certain instances, art, visual art. I think seeing them from the subject position and hearing them is important. Whether it's a political prisoner, whether it's a very, very poor person who's handing out some homeless leaflet, I think insofar as possible, and it's not always easily possible, as you know, to hear them from the subject position instead of having them objectified and hearing the same kinds of platitudes, of moralistic platitudes about them. I think that's an important first step. And when you hear them, what I did is I went back to the records of Texas prisoners who were executed, and I actually got to the final statements, which again I treated. I changed in certain ways. They were extraordinarily articulate and very powerful and very poetic. None of that's heard. They're just, most of them, as you would expect, were Mexican or African American or American Indian, and none of that was heard. They were allowed to have these last words the way they were allowed to have a last meal, but all of it's forgotten. But I didn't want it to be forgotten, so I rescued it. and I put it in a different context. Part of what I read was from that, but I have a large thing called Death in Texas, a large text where I have about 30 prisoners who are about to be executed talk, and I inserted some unusual things in it that didn't belong there. I actually took a 19th century person from a German institution for the mental incapacitated, and I inserted that and made some changes into the prisoners, the death row prisoners. Nobody was able to distinguish that. Nobody said a word about that. It was published in a number of places. Madam, that would be the first step, I think, to allow them to articulate from the subject position, without interfering. I think that itself is not a small first step, because when you allow yourself to hear, or see what people who are otherwise severely marginalized are doing, then even the coldest, least feeling, least compassionate people are not likely, but liable to be moved. And that's not unimportant, I think. Yeah.
As mass communication sort of moves seemingly to increasing forms of literacy, blogs to Facebook social networking profiles to Twitter, are examples, contemporary examples of these sorts of bound texts becoming harder to find?
Well, they're becoming very different. Everything is very abbreviated, which makes it easier for me because I'm deliberately working in very short units. I chose 50 words rather than the number of characters in Twitter because that didn't allow me enough access. But by choosing 50 words, it forced me into closing and opening up certain spaces. Yeah, in the traditional sense, certainly, the discourse has changed. It's much more dumbed down than it was, and the references are much more restricted. You never find any high cultural references, or rarely there. I mean, if you read American newspapers or American, whether online or off, so it's much more parochial, than it was. The advantage of it is that it's brief, because newspapers, ape computers now. So everything looks like U.S. World, U.S. News Today. Everything looks like that now, and so it's easier to plunder. It's easier to bushwhack these texts because of their abbreviation. But yeah, they don't point in as many directions as you'd like them to. On the other hand, if they were cultivated and pointed in those other directions, they might not interest, us plunderers, in the same way, because they would be viable, insofar as, that kind of news could be viable. That's a subtle question. It's a good question.
Here's another question, and it goes to your book. What inspired you to use the Twitter format, and do you use Twitter at all?
The last part was, am I on Twitter myself? I have an account there. I haven't followed it up because I have, between my writing and Fiction International, I'm on so many different social network sites. Sometimes I'm not doing them myself, but the assistants on the journal Fiction International are. I use it. I use it in a emblematic way, as representing the new communication. Anti-Twitter. I mean, I could have said anti-Facebook. Of course, I wanted to use Twitter because of the abbreviation, the extreme abbreviation, and I think it's like text messaging. That's what's been changing, the language. Now, if you ask me what I think about the language being changed, I have mixed feelings. I like some of the innovations that, let's say, rap singers and sports people have used, where they play around with their name, T-Mac for Tracy McGrady and so on. I think that's amusing, and I like that. But the language otherwise is changing in ways that are, you know, funny and theatrical, but I think finally leaving us less leverage, you know, to be expressive than we'd like to be. You know, I like listening to it, but it's the leverage is getting narrower and narrower, and I think that's a problem, and it's moving so fast. That's the reason I dealt with it, because the last 15 years have moved much faster than the previous 50 years, and it's that speed, and often speed without direction, that I wanted to address.
In suicides, was the order of the stories within intended to prepare the reader to sympathize with Hamas suicide bombers? If I would have read it in the opposite order, I likely would have been outraged. Let me just continue through. Instead, I found myself relating to the acts of Hamas, to the acts of the characters in the previous stories, not judging any of them as good or bad, rational or irrational, but simply as acts that somehow fit the context.
That's a very subtle question. I've never been asked that question before, and the answer is yes. You're right. What I did in this text called Suicides, I wrote about the suicides of Mishima, Simone Weil, Johnny Ace, who was an early rhythm and blues singer, and there was somebody else. And the last one was a Hamas suicide bomber, where I just detailed something. Yeah, I was trying to finesse the reader into reading that fairly and in a broader context. That's right, I was. Yeah, that's a very good perception.
There are a couple of...
Yeah, keep going if you like. They're good questions.
Okay, 5 points, 5-point restraints. Virilio, science, has developed solely with a view to the pursuit of limited performances, to the detriment of any effort to discover a coherent truth useful to humanity. Yet doesn't quantum physics seek universal truth?
Yeah, I think quantum physics does. But one of the points that Virilio makes is that increasingly science is allied to technology. That one, I mean, people talk about pure science, but now it's largely become, not entirely, but largely become techno-science. And so when scientists are working and need money, they get money from corporations and they get money from the government. When they get that money, they're compelled. You know, it's like judging some drug that the FDA is putting on the market. They're compelled to respond in a particular way and to leave certain things out. You know, as Nicholas was saying, to omit certain kinds of things. Yeah, I think in principle you're right. You know, certainly quantum mechanics and other aspects of post-Einsteinian and even philosophy, let's say post-Wittgenstein, you know, kind of thinking. I think that's very useful insofar as it could be understood, you know, and even if it's not understood, it's useful in its own way. But I think there's much less of that. Consider, you know, a scientist who's teaching can't make the same kind of living as he or she did previously unless the person's getting grants. And who's giving these grants? I mean, it's that kind of thing. Historians the same way. I mean, if you're Howard Zinn, you know, or Chomsky, you could write pretty much what you want. But even Chomsky has dealt with lots of hate. I was in San Francisco a number of years ago when I did a book with City Lights, and he was giving a talk at Berkeley. And there was a letter from Berkeley professors, many of them Jewish, a number of them previously progressive, who were denouncing him. They were calling him, They're accusing him of Jewish self-hatred, of being pro-Palestinian, of not recognizing the power of the Holocaust. I mean, all of these things, and so it's very difficult to take an independent stance without having the funds to make sure that it's published in such a way that people can read it. Hence, you look for money, and once you look for money, compromises ensue.
Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.